How's it going, everybody? Ricker here, and this is a video about the Caddx Polar camera, a low-light camera designed to be used with the DJI digital FPV system. It can be bought separately on its own for about $55 to $60 US, or it can be bought as part of a kit with the Caddx Vista or the Air unit. The selling point of this one is it's very good in low light. In fact, it has a lux rating of 0.00003 lux. Now, lux rating is the actual available light intensity at which the camera can produce a picture. So for instance, a full moon on a clear night produces about 0.27 lux. So that means that we can fly this even in darker conditions than a full moon. A quarter moon produces about 0.01 lux. So yeah, this camera can produce some really good low light quality results. As with everything, however, there are some trade-offs. So this camera can only transmit in high quality mode. We experienced that limitation with the Nebula Nano last year. So if you're not really into the 60 frame per second transmission with the 16:9 wide aspect ratio and the slightly higher millisecond latency, then you're not really gonna like the Polar camera. But with the low light performance, I think that at night or even the high quality image during the day is going to be its selling point. It doesn't beat out the original DJI FPV camera's 120 frame per second transmission, but it sure as hell beats out the DJI camera's low light performance, which is pretty crappy in comparison. Here's the DJI FPV camera at night, well after sunset, so this is pretty much pitch black, and we're starting in low latency mode. And as you kind of travel beyond the limits of those parking lot lights, that's when you start to realize, ooh, it's almost completely black out there. It's really hard to see. In fact, it's almost impossible to fly around out there without having flown there previously during the day and you know your boundaries and what's around. There's really no way to tell. Switching to high quality mode with the DJI FPV camera actually made it a little bit better. I was pleased to see the improvement between low latency and high quality mode with the DJI FPV camera. With the Polar camera, however, you can see a lot more. You can actually start to see details in the trees and details in the grass beyond the parking lot, and it becomes flyable. I mean, you wouldn't want to spend a whole lot of time out there, but you can at least get around and you can kind of go from spot to spot and bounce around and not have to worry about, flying into a tree that was completely invisible because you couldn't see your hand in front of your face or something like that. The field of view is definitely different, not only because we're using our 16:9 image versus our possible 4:3 image with the DJI FPV camera, but you can see our field of view is 160 degrees diagonal versus 150 with the DJI FPV camera. So we get a noticeable more amount of sideways horizontal field of view. We also get a little bit of vertical field of view, but I didn't perfectly match the camera tilts from one camera to the next, so it's kind of hard to tell in this comparison image, but you can definitely tell on the sides we're getting more image with the Polar camera. So what makes the Polar so good at night? Well, first of all, it has a bigger sensor. In fact, it's almost twice the size. The original DJI FPV camera had a 1/3.2 inch sensor at 4 megapixels. The Polar camera has a 1/1.8 inch sensor at 8 megapixels. They both have identical ISO ranges, however, also the lens of the Polar camera is a faster lens. When I mean faster, I mean it actually lets more light in through to the sensor. So the Polar camera has an f1.6 lens. The DJI FPV camera has an f2.1 lens. And that's actually a pretty big deal. And I thought, hey, let's run an experiment, put the Polar camera lens on the DJI FPV camera and see if we can get a brighter image from the DJI FPV camera. Well, yes, you can do that. You can get a brighter image by swapping the lenses. However, because of the difference in sensor size, we actually lose a huge amount of field of view on the DJI FPV camera using the Polar lens. So unless we can get a DJI FPV camera lens at f1.6, we're kind of out of luck. So we've done a lot of comparison at night, but during the day, how is it? Well, for fast freestyle, I don't like it during the day. It's a mixture of a high shutter speed, which creates very little motion blur, mixed with the 60 frame per second transmission, which is low considerably for FPV and freestyle and racing and stuff. So when you're flying 60 frames per second with a high shutter speed, it becomes a very stuttery image, and so when you're rolling and flipping, you'll see the frames start to stutter on you, and it's not pretty. I don't like it. I don't really mind the latency. I haven't really found much of a difference in latency, to be honest. I'm not that in tune with my quad's latency like that, but I am in tune with that frame rate, and it does bother me. However, as you go later in the day and you start to get into a low light environment where the camera, the polar camera, is compensating by lowering the shutter speed in order to make a brighter image, then you start to get more motion blur in your image and it starts to look very natural. There's really no difference that I could feel. It felt perfectly fine, except for the 16:9 aspect ratio, which was a little strange. I had to get used to that. But the frame rate, the transmission felt absolutely normal because that lower shutter speed was masking that lower frame rate. One thing that's very weird, and it became something I was getting used to, but initially it was really jolting, was the white balance seems to change on me frequently. As I'm flying, it goes from more of a warm image to more of a cooler image. And that's just, it seems like because I'm doing a flip or I'm diving or I'm doing something where I'm changing my camera angle, either tilted down, tilted up. And for some reason, not only is it changing the auto exposure, it's also changing the white balance. And it's much more than it needs to be. I'm not sure why it's doing that. So it really comes down to your flying style and what you're able to basically, be accustomed to. If you really like your 4x3 with your 120 frames per second because you're just such a quick, and reactionary freestyle pilot that you need everything you can get, you're not going to be pleased with the polar camera. However, for a cruising session or a chasing session, like maybe my 7-inch quad that I want to cruise around with, I think high quality mode with 60 frames per second and a 16:9 immersive aspect ratio would be awesome. And that's why I kind of want to put this on my 7-inch so I can do some chase sessions at night with my friends who have LED lights on their quads and wings and get a really awesome result that maybe I wouldn't be able to do quite so much with the original DJI FPV camera. Now, the DJI FPV camera, as well as the Nebula Pro camera, had in-goggle camera settings. You could adjust your saturation, your brightness, and certain other things like that. You cannot do that in-goggle with the polar camera. But there are solder points on the polar camera that allow you to solder on a control board. I was using a Runcam and I tried a Foxeer board too from back in my analog days, and it worked okay. Only 2 of the 4 buttons actually work, so I can make the camera brighter and less saturated, but I couldn't actually go the opposite direction. I think the Caddx probably has their own board that you could buy separately. I didn't have that at the time. The polar camera is almost a gram heavier than the DJI FPV camera, but its dimensions for mounting are pretty much exactly the same. I pretty much just swapped from my DJI FPV camera to the polar camera on my Armington Marmot, and there was really no difference. I did, however, miss the 4-screw securing system of the DJI FPV camera. The polar camera only has a screw on either side, so I found that it was really difficult to torque down the camera enough to make it so that it wouldn't tilt up or down in a slight crash. On my Armington Marmot, I was out there at night at a parking lot and decided I wanted to try the polar camera on my Marmot after flying the DJI camera around a little bit. No settings to tweak or to change. The air unit or the Vista know exactly how to recognize the polar camera once it's plugged in, and it was easy to swap back and forth that way. So, thank you so much for watching. Hope this video was informative. I know this camera is not exactly new. This isn't breaking news, but thank you to Caddx for sending this polar camera to me, and I hope to try more cameras in the future. Until next time, happy flying.